There was one really powerful day where we went to Lummi Reservation, an Indian reservation in the outskirts of Seattle. And we were speaking to members of the tribe, and somebody was explaining to us that the tribe had recently undergone this really amazing process of determining together what would their definition of prosperity be. And the Lummi had come to a conception of prosperity that was living in accordance with Lummi values. That's a beautiful conception of what prosperity looks like, and the converse, poverty, would be the absence of one or more Lummi values in a person's life. And to sort of amplify that, the very next day we were meeting with a representative from the Potlatch Fund, which serves Native tribes throughout the Northwest, and she was saying that in the Sioux language, that the Sioux don't even have a word for poverty the way that we would think of it in English. I mean, to imagine a culture and a belief system and a way of thinking and a way of treating each other that doesn't even have a word in the language, and that the closest that they had would be a word that roughly means someone with no family or community. To which she quickly added, but that would never happen, that's impossible, because we would never let that happen. So I think to even begin in the big imagination of what would it be like and how could we change our individual and our group and our collective beliefs around prosperity and around poverty that would make us all part of this, as opposed to sort of a dual frame. That was really powerful. So I got very interested, I've been very interested in these questions of power for a long time, but this project and this process of learning really started to refine some questions and some wishes around how we speak about power, how we think about power. So it is in part who has it and who's excluded from it, but preceding that is a more fundamental question. How do we even conceive of power, its nature? What is it? And once I acknowledge that I have a conception of what power is, that conception is determining all my choices about what I'm doing to seek it, what I'm doing to keep it, and ultimately what I'm doing to hoard it. So what I was trying to say in the piece that I wrote is there is a kind of an under-examined default assumption in our culture that power is a dominance-based paradigm. I alluded to Machiavelli, probably one of the most translated texts, for centuries, which seems to be this treatise on how a prince can seek, keep, and ultimately hoard power. But it presumes power in this power over structure, in a dominance-based paradigm that necessitates that someone has power and someone has less, that there's someone over someone else. And what I wanted to say is this is not the only conception of power, and that some indigenous cultures, matriarchal cultures, the arts world, there are a lot of places we can go to see a different conception of power. And Martin Luther King, who I'm also referenced in that little piece, I think maybe articulated it most beautifully. He said, power at its best is love implementing the demands of justice. And justice at its best is love correcting everything that stands against love. So power as love, contrast that with power as dominance. And what is possible in a love conception, and I don't mean that in any soft and ooey way, I mean love implementing the demands of justice. This is not a zero-sum game, as dominance is. It's not competitive, it's collaborative. It's not zero-sum, it's generative. And it's something that just like the Lummi definition of prosperity, my having it not only does not undermine your ability to have it, but it probably reinforces and affirms your ability to have it. If we imagine how our economic systems, how we manage our households, how we think about a lot of choices, how would that change in this kind of conception of power? So there's one answer of who's excluded, whose voices are not heard, that I think has been amplified before, but bears repeating. I think people who are working and devoted to work in these fields understand this, but I think the bigger cultural conversation around poverty is so often about people who aren't experiencing poverty opining about people who are, and it's a profoundly paternalistic orientation around what they might need and why they are there. So we could always, always, always seek to find, uplift, and amplify the voices of people who have experienced it or who are experiencing it, to give dimension to their life, to their challenges, and be able to put ourselves in their shoes. But I think another unheard voice is in some ways more elusive. And that's the voice of those of us who have a house, who have access to quality education, who have access to quality healthcare, who don't have daily existential stress around subsistence, around providing for ourselves and our loved ones. I think that for those of us who have a basic baseline of security and stability, there is an unheard voice that we are not examining, that we are not mining, that goes to, what am I doing? What am I doing? How does this show up in my day? What am I doing to co-create the conditions for these forces in my environment? Am I, what are the stories I'm telling myself that that influence my choices around food, around housing, where I live, who else lives there, who else gets to live there, around school, where do I go to school, where do my kids go to school, who else goes to school there? And are these stories, to use today's vernacular, are these stories bridging stories or breaking stories? Who's not served in my stories? And could I think of a bigger story that would lift up all instead of sort of seek advantage for me?